I want to specifically break down my view of what a right actually is. A right, as far as I can see it, is an artificial construct we've invented in order to facilitate and protect human life. It's nothing more than an expression of tribalistic human self-interest. Now, rights are constructs that exist to make civilization easier. They are artificial concepts that prop up the helpful lie that is civilization, and civilization is a survival mechanism and really an expression of the primacy of human life according to the human species. Before I expand on this, let's talk about the mathematical concept of infinity for a better understanding of how abstract concepts can and do translate to practical applications for the human being. Now, if we take 1 and divide it by infinity, what we're doing is dividing a real number, the number 1, by an infinitely large denominator. And we can clearly see that by dividing 1 by 2, and 1 by 4, and 1 by 6, that as the value of the denominator gets larger, the result of our division gets smaller, starting from 1/2 to 1/4 to 0.16 respectively. So dividing 1 by infinity is the same as dividing 1 by an infinitely large number, which will give us an infinitesimal result. But what did we actually divide 1 by? Did we divide it by infinity? What is infinity? It can't have a fixed value, it can't end. It's impossible to sit there and divide by increasingly larger numbers forever until we get to infinity. It's an abstract mathematical concept that allows us to calculate fixed numbers in problems that utilize the concept of infinity. We see this in the concept of limits in calculus or integration, which is dividing a regular shape into an infinite amount of subintervals to get the volume or the area. So artificial constructs like these aid us in determining valuable and relevant information. Now, what rights are, again, are artificial constructs that allow us to determine a standard of behavior that is directly against the laws of nature in some respects and in keeping with it in other respects. It's a form of combating the individual survival instinct and prioritizing the survival of the collective human species. Now, on the individual scale, if we look back at our history, we can see that human beings regularly committed infanticide for reasons directly related to survival. We have in the past prioritized our individual survival by saying after giving birth to a mentally retarded, unaffordable, and unwanted child, that infanticide is necessary for my individual survival and well-being, and we then historically have snuffed out that child's existence, and let's not mince words here, commit the act of murder for the survival of the individual or small tribe. And of course, I'm not condoning infanticide in any way here, I'm simply conveying to you the most likely thought process behind our historical propensity for infanticide. This was, not surprisingly, a commonplace occurrence when the human species consisted of disparate nomadic tribes where other members of the human species from different roving tribes were come across so rarely that they may as well have existed on another planet. So in these situations, another mouth to feed, a helpless infant mouth that could not seek out food for the tribe for years to come, could very well have ended the tribe, and this would have appeared to this tribe as the end of human existence. They would have viewed it as a functional apocalypse for their tribe and their people and their way of life and their unique understanding of the world. So snuffing out the life of an infant was an act that prioritized human survival of the tribe. Now, in modern civilization, we do the exact opposite for similar reasons of survival. We prioritize even the life of the weak and defenseless, the mentally handicapped infant, for example, and the mechanism that we use to justify the burden of sustaining a life that will never reasonably be able to sustain itself or provide any significant contribution to the betterment of our species is the abstraction that is the human right. You see, rights are nothing more than a communal enforcement of a certain basic set of moralities and expectations for the purposes, again, of prioritizing the survival of the tribe, which now consists of a global tribe comprised of billions of human beings. There is nothing in my observations that actually confers rights onto any individual. Like the concept of infinity, rights are human inventions that prioritize human survival, and this is why rights change with human advancement and our ability to redefine the optimum method of survival for our species. Now, one of the inconsistencies I see with the term natural rights is the idea that the basis for a, quote, natural right is whether or not this right can be sustained by the bearer of this right, meaning that a natural right only exists if you can uphold the right yourself. So let's keep that in mind, because another contradictory claim I often hear by the proponents of natural rights is that human beings are born with certain inalienable natural rights, the first and foremost of these rights being the right to life. With that said, I'd like to pose the question of the newborn infant. The infant is born according to those who claim all human beings are born with inalienable rights, with the inalienable right to life. But a human infant, being born completely helpless, cannot by definition sustain its own life. Not only can it not procure food for itself, but it does not even understand the fact that food will keep him or her alive. Thus, the human infant, according to the tenets of natural rights, both has no natural right to life since it cannot sustain its own life, and also is born with an inalienable right to life. Now, before expanding on that, I'd like to quote Murray Rothbard, who can arguably be considered one of the founders of modern American libertarianism, or at the very least, one of the most influential modern American libertarians, who had this to say specifically about what natural rights, if any, exist for children. And this is from his work, The Ethics of Liberty. He says, quote, "A parent does not have the right to aggress against his children, but also the parent should not have a legal obligation to feed, clothe, or educate his children, since such obligations would entail positive acts coerced upon the parent and deprive the parent of his rights. The parent, therefore, may not murder or mutilate his child, and the law properly outlaws a parent from doing so. But the parent should have the legal right not to feed the child, i.e. to allow it to die. The law, therefore, may not properly compel the parent to feed a child or to keep it alive," and he says in parentheses, "whether or not a parent has a moral rather than a legally enforceable obligation to keep his child alive is a completely separate question." He continues by saying, "This rule allows us to solve such vexing questions as, should a parent have the right to allow a deformed baby to die, for example, by not feeding it? The answer is, of course, yes, following a fortiori from the larger right to allow any baby, whether deformed or not, to die." End quote. So a question I would pose to the proponent of natural rights is naturally, which is it? Do children, and specifically infants, have an inalienable right to life, or are they, like Rothbard suggests, allowed to suffer starvation at the hands of unwilling parents with respect to the parents' so-called natural rights? Now, regardless of the answer of this question, we all know that the vast majority of people are going to absolutely insist that a parent absolutely cannot be allowed to allow his or her child to starve, which supports my theory that rights are once again social norms invented by humans that maximize human survival instead of preconceived entitlements derived from nature that have any intrinsic innateness to the human being. In order to further demonstrate this, I propose a scenario in which committing murder of infants would quickly become a reality and a right, given a certain scenario, and again, I wish to make it absolutely clear that this is completely hypothetical, and I in no way endorse the murder of infants or the murder of any human beings. This is a thought experiment. This is a thought experiment. Anybody insinuating that I'm condoning any of this will be banned outright. So, let's say then that tomorrow humanity discovered that there will be every year a person born with a communicable disease that could spread fast enough to kill off the entire human population, and that scientists could determine to a 100% certainty where the birth would happen, but not when it would happen until after the birth happened. Let's call this person Baby X. And let's assume that the method by which scientists identified Baby X was due to a unique birthmark that the disease causes. Let's also assume that our current medical knowledge is not sufficient to determine any useful methods of fighting this disease. Now, this scenario is highly hypothetical, but certainly not out of the realm of possibility. But the moment one of these Baby X's were born bearing this unique mark, humanity would be forced with the decision of either respecting Baby X's natural right to life and liberty and therefore allowing him or her to grow to adulthood and to walk freely in society instead of quarantining her for life, and thus putting humanity in the precarious position of having to constantly protect others from this communicable disease. The other option, of course, is killing Baby X instantly at birth every year. Again, what we're talking about here is extremely immoral, and of course I do not condone murder by saying this. But I suspect that killing Baby X instantly from birth would become the norm very quickly in such a society, and Baby X's so-called right to life wouldn't matter because rights are cultural memes that again maximize survival according to the environment a population of human beings exist in, nothing more. Now at this point, what I most often hear as a rebuttal is that natural rights are a reflection of what rights ought to be instead of what actually exists. But this still leaves us in a position of who and what determines what these rights actually ought to be. It's often said that these rights derive from nature, but the statement still lacks detail since, first off, we as a species are just beginning to feebly grasp the mysteries of nature, and our perceptions of nature as individuals are exceedingly variable. So from my perspective, the factors that determine rights are actually much more dependent on environment and advances in technology than anything else. And this is what decides not human nature, but the expression of human nature, and that is what decides what rights are. and what form they take. We, as human beings, as a species, have a habit of defining things that are beyond our comprehension with words that incorrectly attach our inability to fathom them to their actual state in nature and reality. This goes back to the concept of infinity. The roll of a die, for example, can in fact, if you know the original conditions of how it was thrown, and the mass of the die, and the velocity and direction that it was thrown in, and the friction constants of the material the die is being thrown on, if you know all these factors, a powerful enough supercomputer should theoretically be able to tell you how the die will land every time without fail. It would of course be extremely difficult to devise a means of plotting out the vectors associated with how every unique human hand throws a die. And the possible outcomes of casting a die are so variable that they may as well be random in terms of how we perceive it. But they are not random. They follow the laws of mechanical motion to a T. My theory is that human society follows these same predictable patterns. Human society, if we define it as the totality of human interactions with each other and the environment around us, can be, given a sufficiently powerful method of calculation, described down to the most minute detail, possibly in the form of an incomprehensibly complex mathematical function. Incomprehensible, at least to us. And my evidence to support this is found in our very own behavior. Human beings instinctively know this on some level, I'm convinced of it. Take, for example, the quant phenomenon, and these are mathematicians hired by Wall Street interests for the purpose of deriving mathematical equations and functions that attempt to quantify fear and risk and speculation. And in fact, the Black-Scholes equation, and this is the first equation used to quantify the risk associated with the price of a stock. This equation is, interestingly enough, almost identical to the equation for heat diffusion. Human behavior, as infinitely random as it may seem to us, follows set paths, and there are most likely trillions of different paths that humanity can follow, but they are not limitless. And since, as I've said earlier, that rights are determined and created in relation to how emergent technologies tweak the expression of human nature, the emergence of new rights, or the adoption and creation of new rights and liberties could, given a powerful enough supercomputer, be predicted along a trajectory of how our species manipulates the environment around them. Meaning that rights are both created and eventually done away with as a function of a manipulation of nature, as opposed to being inherent to nature. At least that's the way I see it. And this is not to say that rights aren't just as important as they are when we mistakenly believe they derive from some natural or even supernatural force. I gave you the mathematical concept of infinity to show you that there can be abstract concepts based on what we can assume to be correct, but never actually prove, that do in fact serve humanity very well. We don't divide by infinity. We assume that if we could, our result would have to be zero, no matter the numerator. And so when dealing with the concept of rights, it's important, if it's possible at all, that we view rights as important and even indispensable artificial constructs of a society that, again, helps to maximize the survival rates of the people living within the given society. But it's also as important to avoid taking the next step towards rationalizing away the artificiality of rights just because we derive benefit from them. Again, from my observations, there is nothing in nature that confers rights onto individuals. Rights are not tangible. They are artifacts that human beings have made up in their heads and chosen to believe. They are convenient fictions that have only ever existed when human beings decided to dream them up. There are things in this universe, to be sure, that do derive from nature. There are things in this universe that confer mass onto physical objects. And so if we discover what confers mass onto an object, the Higgs boson or something, we can prove that it's been there way before the first human beings walked the earth. There exists no evidence for rights in the animal kingdom predating humanity, and in fact the concept of even animal rights has never existed until the human animal came to invent it. So again, I perceive no actual force that has ever conferred a right onto a human being. Most likely what they actually are merely social etiquettes exclusive to our species that we follow, and our outrage and indignation when these rights are breached represents our survival instinct telling us that if we don't hold to these artificial constructs, we can devolve very quickly into a very violent and very animalistic situation. Which of course nobody wants. The problem with buying completely into the lie of a right derived from some force of nature, or some condition of nature, is that this too can send us careening towards civilizational collapse. And a relevant example of this is our species being a victim of our own reproductive success. I'm talking about our descent into romance culture, traditionalism, and the like. which, as I've said many times in previous videos, is an approach to reproduction that helped us build civilization based on a set of conditions we thought could never change, i.e. the male as provider, woman as reproductive vehicle exchange. We existed within this dynamic that allowed this exchange for so long that we created artificial constructs like love and romance and the quote special bond between men and women, and then we actually started to believe our own bullshit. And technological advancements have changed the way human nature is expressed to a degree that the romantic fiction we built this civilization on is now a major contributor to the collapse it's currently undergoing. So I leave you with the statement that civilizations based on convenient fictions generally do not take well to having those fictions questioned, and usually end up choosing collapse over adaptation. So again, in conclusion, to say that rights are artificial constructs does not, in my opinion, deprive them of their potency. In a sense, viewing them in this sense gives us a greater understanding of what they are and what they're used for.